Okay, I'll present to you today the article on human rights and democracy in Brazil and the construction of universalism and human rights can be divided into various stages, but we'll focus on philosophical answers and major historical events and the Declaration of Man and Citizen, inspired by the Declaration of Independence, drove a two-pronged process in the context of the evolution of capitalism, socialism, and democracy. This is essential to the substantiation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if we want to understand the stance of constitutions and parliamentary substitutes nowadays, we have to understand that human rights have static standards and in a penumbra of doubt dynamic policies, and according to the weighting ratio, fundamental changes can be made over time unless the Constitution does contain eternity clauses. And quintessential to the transformation of different determinative vectors is the pre-classification of the triad of rights. The first layer consists of negative rights, who protect individuals against abuse from a state, and then the second layer consists of rights, the right to be subject to a right entitlement, and ultimately transcendental rights can only proliferate if individuals are living in a state of positive peace, meaning the contrary is not present. And this layer's differentiation appear gossamer thin at first glance, but its doctrinal foundation almost triggered the Cold War, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights expressed a minimum standard of human rights globally in 1948, and shortly after, countries began grappling for the benchmark of its recognition, and the curtain between the Convention on Civil and Political Rights was endorsed by Western states, and communist states upheld the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And in its merits, the first sheet consists of the individual specification of the underprivileged, and the second of the specification of the subject, meaning conditions or features in a given context. So the three alignment vectors here are the recognition of civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural human rights, and communitarism or solidarity. They are numbered in this matrix as 1, 1, 2, 2, and 3, 3. In order to assess multiculturalism, we have to consider culture, social identity, gender, sexual orientation, political orientation, and physical, as well as the mental constitution as underprivileged enhancing features. And communitarism advocates for the eradiction of social identity, hence the specification of underprivileged features based on the individual's civil status under the assumption of ethnic or cultural neutrality. And in most countries, civil and political rights are recognized if they encompass the middle path, meaning not only a balanced judiciary and the rule of law, but also approaches entailed in 2.2 and 3.3 in their individual constitutional matrix. And a derecognition of both points can lead to the proclamation of the état d'émergence or estado de emergencia in order to justify military presence outside transportation hubs. So in the Brazilian context, especially federal states bordering with Venezuela or with Amazonian territory can understand multiculturalism as a mechanism to prevent injustice. And Article 231 of the Constitution provides land rights for Indians, and in its translation, it's Indians and not indigenous people, to ensure respect for all the properties. Article 210 is the right to be educated in Portuguese, hence indigenous language can be used for own learning procedures, and the preservation of native language through institutionalization is not on the government's agenda yet, although Article 216 on cultural preservation includes material and immaterial goods, and paragraph 1 is a bit more specific and addresses all forms of expression, and this could lift the defamatory burden that comes with the practice of native languages without giving rise to secessionist claims, as the protection of those languages is already endorsed by the Constitution. So the importance of liberty, equality, and property can, in a top-down approach, unlock Brazilian's green bond market, and climate investment could, in a mutually beneficial way, combine policy strategies in the combat for social equality, property, and climate justice. And the Brazilian Forestry Code provides input for distributors' benefits for agribusiness credit rights certificates, and currently indigenous people are preserving 13.9% of vegetal properties, and the civil code improved equality in the acquisition, management, and administration of property acquired after marriage. Customary rules continue to undermine those property rights, and with the Venezuelan refugee crisis, federal states have incentives to engage in inclusive land policies. In this context, ecofeminism is essentially about the linkage between women's rights, environmental justice, and social justice. And the drastic decrease of birth rates of marginalized women due to voluntary sterilization illustrates the question of choice, and that the question of choice and the quality of life are crucial ones. And at the same time, this movement could find fertile ground in Brazil, as Bertha Lutz fought for women's voting rights, Mirella Franco for social justice, and Sonia Bonjajara is the leader of the indigenous community, and combining green bonds, top-down approaches with the social bottom-up of social bottom-up approaches of ecofeminism could increase the critical stance of indigenous communities significantly. And when it comes to efficient policies, I guess Nepal could be a good example, as households there in which women own land are 33% less likely to be severely underweight. And in Rwanda, for instance, women are 19% more likely to engage in the soil conservation compared to men. And principles for an efficient woman engagement in the decision-making process in land investment agreements have been set up in a cooperation between Oxfam and the IISD. As you can see on the slides, women should engage in all these 5 stages of the negotiation and have the possibility to exit the agreements at any time. And in this last reflection, we'll look into the human rights foreign policy in Brazil and South Africa. And Brazil filled the heterogenic power vacuum by building alliances with controversial partners such as Turkey during the Iranian nuclear missile crisis. And this diffuse swings towards extremist positions on both sides of the political spectrum, and the emergence of ISPA and BRICS initiatives under Lula aim to promote under the umbrella of active and lofty agenda multipolarization of the world order, and this strategy is called Brazilian revisionism. And apart from 2011, Rousseff complemented the concept by a non-intervention and non-indifference approach, and this peaked in Brazil's support for the mission of inquiry into human rights violations committed by Israel during the recent military operation in Palestine. And at the same time, Brazilian revisionism could be considered as a weakness in the international human rights arena. I don't see how contradictions between strategic and normative agendas are not kind of normal to a certain extent. And if we look back into the denunciation of own criteria for justification for a justification of politicized and selective condemnation of human rights violations, Brazil's role as pragmatic mitigator of normative human rights had significant impacts in Latin America and Africa, by virtue of 2 factors. First of all, Brazil has a high degree of ethnical diversity, and second is that Brazil was independent way before most African countries. Therefore, the country has experience with specific issues, countries with a high degree of diversity, not only ethnical, but also social and maybe cultural, are usually facing. And then South Africa began holding pragmatic relationships with controversial partners, and it remained unclear to what extent the country would be ready to sacrifice counter-hegemonic alliances on behalf of the defense of human rights. And during Mbeki, the policies during the post-apartheid reign were characterized by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and similar movements can be found in Brazil and India as well. Nevertheless, South Africa's role in regional integration can be challenged by its support for Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe in the implementation of a very controversial land reform and hosting President al-Bashir of Sudan, while an arrest warrant was issued by the ICC was not that holistic. Further, South Africa condemned the abuses committed by President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, while at the same time supporting the African Union's decision to suspend Egypt Therefore, problematically, the light South Africa does shed on human rights abuses in the region is often biased. But maybe South Africa is advocating on the wrong continent in pursuit of more alliances with counter-hegemonic partners as very strong ties within the African community and union already exists. So the major takeaway is that Brazil and South Africa are both trying to be consistent in their position as moderate revisionists, claiming for new standards and systemic organization of human rights based on multilateral dialogue and cooperation rather than arm twisting.